workers. In other words, he's going to argue for the freedom of workers to move where he wants. Immigrants moving in and doing and working can drive down wages, but in the long run, it is healthy because then you've got dynamism. And for Smith, so much of what he wants to argue is about that important dynamism, right? There's so many passages that I'm going to avoid reading here just simply because of the length of this text. Chapter 11 of the rent of land. Rent is always as high as landlords can get. We're familiar with this idea, right? Connected to prices of products. As prices go up, so does rent. Landowners, right? They don't do anything to make their money, and to that degree, he's not totally sure that they're really that valuable, and yet they're necessary. I'm not altogether sure his argument works, but there it is. Just jumping to a final comment in this chapter, he says it this way: gain is the end of all improvement, and nothing could deserve that name of which loss was to be the necessary consequence. This idea that we're all kind of out, and this will be his argument of the invisible hand, that everyone has their own self-interest, and because that's the case, we should allow for that and nurture that in society, and therefore we will have wealthy nations. From book 1, we now move to book 2. And in book 2, we're going to have the title of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. In his introduction, he says, people's personal stock of wealth is very important. But people can't work without some personal wealth, right? I mean, think about that. They have to have some amount of savings to be able to even go out and work. In other words, you've got to have enough already to be able to have some expectation of the paycheck that's coming. If you literally are living from paycheck to paycheck without any kind of savings, he says, you're in a world of hurt. It's not going to work out, right? In chapter 1, he talks about the division of stock. He says there's two kinds of savings. And by the way, put this in your notes. Smith is very much interested in the way all people will save their resources. That will, as well, predict how they spend their resources, but that will have a lot to do with whether a nation is considered wealthy or not, right? He says it this way: there are two kinds of savings. That you can spend now, that kind of money in your pocket, walking around cash, and then investments, which of course are capital. And we have circulating capital that you have to cash in, and then fixed capital, like for example, improving your lands. Okay, and then just to read a line here for this one, he says, "A man must be perfectly crazy who, where there is tolerable security, does not employ all the stock which he commands, whether it be in his own or borrowed of other people, in some one or other of those three ways." In other words, he says, you always are seeking to make more wealth. And a wealthy nation is a nation of workers who are always seeking to make more wealth. That is vital to understanding what Smith has to say about a strong nation. Chapter 2 of Book 2 is of money considered as a particular branch of the general stock of the society or of the expense of maintaining the national capital. And here he'll talk about gross versus net revenue. He's going to explain that net revenue is gross revenue minus the costs involved. Wealth is not measured with money, he will argue. Now this is very controversial. He says, money does not determine wealth. Money has value if it can purchase stuff. Nations control wealth through banking systems, he says. Banks, he argues, needs to have some kind of regulation because banks can cripple an economy if, for example, they engage in fraud and the like. Of course, in our own nation's history, we are all too familiar with what happens when lending institutions and banks commit certain kinds of egregious activities, right? It does cripple the nation, no question. He says it this way: in order to put industry into motion, three things are requisite: materials to work upon, tools to work with, and the wages or recompense for the sake of which the work is done. Money is neither a material to work upon nor a tool to work with. And though the wages of the workman are commonly paid to him in money, his real revenue, like that of other men, consists not in the money, but in the money's worth. Not in the metal pieces, but in what can be got for them. In other words, money is only good to the degree that it can buy you something in exchange, right, for your labor. I think it's a brilliant insight, and it's obviously an important insight for us as we are young and we're starting to think about the whole notion of what constitutes wealth in the future of my life. Okay, on to chapter 3, and the next bit of work of the accumulation of capital, or of productive and unproductive labor. Now he talks about two kinds of labor in this chapter. Productive labor adds value, kind of like running a factory. Unproductive labor doesn't add any value. For example, a household servant, while important and necessary, doesn't add any value to that person's wealth, right? Countries need to focus on productive labor, producing new things. This is pivotal to the influence of this text from 1776 on. Nations then are not wealthy because they have lots of money. Nations are wealthy, right, and in proportion to the goods that the country produces. How valuable these goods actually are, that will determine the wealth of the nation, right? For example, he will say, a man grows rich by employing a multitude of manufacturers. He grows poor by maintaining a multitude of menial servants. It's just a classic example of a line here. And again, I'm fighting the tendency to not read too much of this text here, but I think it makes sense to at least try and read a couple of lines to this. He says it this way: bankruptcy is perhaps the greatest and most humiliating calamity which can befall an innocent man. The greater part of men, therefore, are sufficiently careful to avoid it. Some, indeed, do not avoid it, as some do not avoid the gallows. In other words, excuse me, you should work to try and be the most intelligent you can with your money, and obviously try to avoid, if you can, any kind of bankruptcy. In chapter 4 of the stocks, lent, and the interest, here he'll say it this way: the stock which is lent at interest is always considered as a capital by the lender. He expects that in due time it's to be restored to him, and that in the meantime the borrower is to pay him a certain annual rent for the use of it. In this chapter, he then will comment on this notion of interest. Now, excuse me, we have in Dante, in our study of Dante, as we pointed out, that tension about putting the users someplace in hell, because they, of course, used money to make money. But notice, by the time Adam Smith is writing this text, we obviously have a completely different view. Moving on now quickly to chapter 5, of the different employment of capital, he will talk about, of capitals, he will talk about. Merchants, store owners, are an important part of division of labor. They allow the producer to not worry about how to sell. In other words, the farmer can make all this stuff, the rancher can grow all this cattle, but if he doesn't have, or she doesn't have a way to sell it, to produce, to market it, then you got problems. A farmer, however, is the most productive of laborers, right? This is why he will argue American colonies are growing. A country produces most wealth when government allows private business to grow and to create private profit, right? This will be one of the central arguments of Smith's Wealth of Nations. Leave people alone, let them thrive in their business, and you will have a dynamic nation. Moving on now to book 3, and in some ways this is kind of a bridge book to remind us really of kind of what matters in in economics and in economic theory. And here we'll have just it's a very brief book with a single chapter of the different progress of opulence in different nations. In the first chapter, and the only chapter of the natural progress of opulence, the way that opulence or wealth grows, he comments on farms. He says farms are the most important because they allow people to survive by growing food. To improve the farmland, farmers, however, need banks. So there is a natural symbiosis, right? Banks are, of course, in the towns. Banks loan farmers money for technology and machinery and the building of, obviously, the necessaries on the farming. And, of course, in the city you've got the factories. That is to say, there is an order of importance here. Agriculture leads to manufacturing, which leads to foreign trade. It's all symbiotic. And in that process, that's where true wealth in a nation actually comes from. Obviously, reading all of this as it relates to those burgeoning colonies in 1776 is a powerful way to study history, no question. Book 4 for us then is, after this little bridge book, Book 4 is a pivotal book for us. We have, however, just to summarize really quickly, we'll have the introduction that will begin this one, okay? And here we'll have 2 goals of the science of political economy as he'll talk about it. You got to provide money for all people, no question. But you also have to provide money for public institutions, schools, hospital, roads, and the like. We often don't think about this, but that's such a significant thing. I mean, if you don't have schools, then you don't have an enlightened citizenry, and therefore economics are going to fail. There's really just 2 kinds of systems, according to Smith. Now, obviously, we read this today and we kind of chuckle, right? Because obviously our economic systems are far more complicated because of technologies. But he says there's commerce and there's agriculture, and there's a certain kind of symbiosis between the 2, as we have already seen. The first chapter of this one then will be of the principle of the commercial or mercantile system. And then the second chapter will be the discouragement of agriculture after the fall of Rome. And then the third chapter is going to talk about the rise of cities after the fall of Rome. We're going to think about Edward Gibbon. And then finally in chapter 4, the commerce of towns and how that helped the country, the relationship, in other words, between the 2. And this is going to be his argument that the American colonies are growing wealthier even as he's doing his reading and his research, right? He says it in chapter 1. Nations will grow rich not because of money, but rather because of trade. Trade is what defines wealth. That's the key. There must be a healthy balance of trade, though, right? You can't export more than you import, okay? In chapter 2, he will say it this way. Putting restrictions on imports of foreign goods is usually bad. It allows monopolies and therefore driving prices up. The overall good of society then is raised when each person pursues his or her own selfish interest. This is the notion of the invisible hand. This is again a pivotal argument that he will make. And I think that, you know, this is kind of one of those passages that becomes so famous. Let's just read it really quickly again out of chapter 2. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It's an affectation, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need be employed in dissuading them from it. In other words, we all have our own selfish interests. By the way, in some ways you may argue this is the birth of Ayn Rand's view as we study it in Atlas Shrugged, that idea that all of us have certain kinds of needs, interests, and we pursue those, and a society then grows in relationship to the way that that's all done, right? To that degree, he says, it's better to import goods made elsewhere. People, he says, will lose jobs, but then they will go out and find ways to create other jobs. It's not competition, he says, it's cooperation through trade that ultimately leads to tremendous wealth. And he says Britain will never have full free trade, right? Because the lobbying interests protect their monopolies. Some taxes, he says, on imports are necessary, again, for public institutions, especially schools, as he'll get to in a little bit. In the third chapter, he says, what if you're importing more than you exporting? He says, it doesn't have to make the country poor. On the concerns, for example, of French cheap wine, he says the poor consume way more of this, right? Just as important as import-exports is the value of what you produce compared to the value of what the nation consumes. A nation should not consume more than it purchases, right? It will become poor if it does so. The fourth chapter, really quickly, I'll try and move through this as quickly as I can now with you. The fourth chapter of drawbacks, he says it this way: merchants and manufacturers are not contented with the monopoly of the home market, but desire likewise the most extensive foreign sale for their goods. The country has no jurisdiction in foreign nations, and therefore can seldom procure them any monopoly there. The idea that monopolies happen, and Smith is very conscious of the value of merchants making money, but the concern that monopolies can sometimes lead to an unhealthy economic policy. And he will, in fact, make a study of the English treaties of 1703, for example, in this chapter. In chapter 7 of Colonies, here now he's going to spend some time remembering, of course, published in 1776, and he says it this way: the wealthy of the mother country, of course, here we think of England as it relates to American colonies, right, send the poor elsewhere seeking wealth. And that's how colonies actually get started. Because why? Well, the wealthy of the mother country don't want to give up their land or their wealth. Smith will criticize, however, the way that Europe has treated badly other peoples as they've come in to colonize, but, he has pointed out, colonies do produce wealth, no question. He says America has grown, in large measure, because it's not a monarchy but a democracy where, he says, things get done a whole lot faster and more efficient. Smith will, in this chapter 7 as well, condemn slavery on its moral grounds as well as its economic grounds. It's not very economical, he says. England, he says, will be better if they would just allow for the American colonists to have independence, but he recognizes that's not going to happen. Although he does make this prediction that colonies are going to cost England a whole lot of money to try to control and maintain. And of course, with the war that was coming after 1776, Smith obviously looked like a major prophet, didn't he? In chapter 8, he talks about mercantilism, when a government encourages exports and discourages imports. And what's wrong with mercantilism is that economies are not based on production, but rather on consumption, right? And therefore, producers create this system to protect their own interests. And this is, again, one of the concerns about monopolies. In chapter 9, he celebrates agriculture one more time. He talks about neat produce, which we call net produce, the difference from gross produce, where gross produce, everything you produce. Neat produce is what's left over after all the expenses, right? And he will call net produce, or neat produce, more important in determining if a nation is truly wealthy. He says, farmers need manufacturers, just like manufacturers need farmers. Again, we're back to that notion. And he talks about a free society. And he says in a free society, government has 3 important duties. Think about and see if this is in fact changed. Did a 3B question. Is this still the case? The 3 major things that government must do. Of course, when we study the Declaration of Independence, we point out that, in fact, Jefferson seems to follow Locke in some regards and say something very similar to what's being said here. Notice three roles of government. 1, protect society from outside invasion. That's why you got to have an army. 2, protect society from itself internally. That's why you have to have law enforcement and police. And finally, 3, you have to provide public institutions like schools or hospitals. And that's the role of government. That's what government is supposed to do. He says, because of these things, these needs, there will always be a need for taxes. But he will argue that taxes should be very intentional and as low as possible. We now turn to book 5, the final book of Wealth of Nations. And in the first chapter, it's the great chapter on education. We already mentioned education, so here we go. He says, modern economics need a military, which obviously is fueled by taxes. Because you can't have agriculture. I mean, think about it. You can't be out there in the field working if you're worried that some outside invader is going to come in and slaughter you and take all that you've produced, right? So you got to have a sense of security. You also need a fair justice system, right, and a police force, so that way you can feel like you're safe within your own nation. Smith admits that people who are wealthier, richer, often do get treated better than the poor within the judicial system. But be that as it may, you still got to have the judicial system. Got to have it. Public institutions, he says, should not be, however, privatized. He says they don't work as well if they're privatized. He says Public school, for example, is vital, and everybody's got to have it. Now Smith, this is one of his great insights, because he says one of the keys to having a wealthy nation is to having an enlightened citizenry. Everyone has to be educated well, right? He says, it's interesting though, maybe we should have it this way, where students pay teachers, because teachers then are effective as instructors. I don't know if you guys want to do that one or not with the teachers of our school. He says, in the end, and this is pivotal, schools should serve the needs of the kids in the communities that they are from. That's their job. All kids, he said, have to learn how to read, write, and compute, the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, as we sometimes say it. And one of the interesting insights is, if they're not, they'll easily be cheated and misled and misinformed, and then more easily become poor. It's a compelling argument. The importance as well, he finishes, it's kind of interesting. He says, hey, outsiders look at your country. They need to see your leader, your ruler, your king, whatever, living in a sumptuous, opulent palace. Therefore, taxes need to be spent on that. So that when people look, they don't look at where your king or your rulers live and they kind of go, sheesh. It's interesting, those of us who have spent any time in Washington, D.C., to look at those government buildings and to be immediately impressed by their magnificence. Smith already predicting that's an important part of it as well. He does make this observation about taxes. Rich people should be taxed at a higher rate than poor people, because obviously $1 for a rich man is a whole lot less than $1 for a poor man. Right? Chapter 2 of Book 5, Smith finally admits the need for some taxing. However, it's got to be articulated and it's got to be intentional. There must be clearly articulated taxing processes, and this long chapter will provide all kinds of insight from history as he shows how taxpayers should pay only when it's convenient during the year for them to do so. In other words, taxing should be about as least painful